Well, greetings, students, and welcome to the presentation on nonviolent protest. I think your text does an outstanding job of chronicling the Indian independence movement. Now, you're responsible for that material, and I'm not going to go over it again in a lecture because it's laid out perfectly in the text. The other reading is the Mark Engler article about nonviolent protest, which I think is outstanding. But we're going to delve just a little bit more into this concept of nonviolence in this presentation. And here are the two essential questions. What is nonviolent protest? And is it effective? Now imagine you're confronted with naked aggression. Your opponent is supremely powerful, and you perceive this opponent as extremely evil. Do you meet force with force? Or do you opt for a nonviolent approach to defeating this enemy? I love the quote from George Orwell in the Engler article. George Orwell was the author of Animal Farm, 1984, famous British political satirist and novelist. When he was asked about nonviolent approaches to Adolf Hitler, he said the following: if they, being proponents of nonviolent protest, imagine that one can somehow overcome the German army by lying on one's back, let them go on imagining it. But let them also wonder occasionally whether this is not an illusion due to security, too much money, and simple ignorance of the way things actually happen. I thought that was powerful and compelling. And then there's this amazing quote from, in the Engler article, from Gandhi on what he thought that the Jews should do when faced with extermination. Gandhi said the following: the Jews should have prepared in mass to sacrifice their lives in order to arouse the world and the people of Germany to Hitler's violence. Now think about that. Would it have been effective for the Jews in Germany to just merely commit suicide, to rouse world opinion against Hitler? I imagine that many of you would look at Gandhi's ideas as naive. I imagine many of you would feel great sympathy for what Orwell had to say. And if you look at a couple of recently modern examples from history, it's easy to look at what Orwell said and agree with him. In World War II, the Allies unleashed spectacular violence upon the Axis powers to defeat Hitler and end the Holocaust. Look at this iconic photo. These are SS female guards who are being forced at gunpoint to unload Jewish corpses into a mass grave for proper burial. When you look at pictures like this, you think of the Nazi war machine and you think of great evil. As a matter of fact, most young people today, if you talk about World War II, will immediately think of the Holocaust. They'll immediately look at this as a great crusade, World War II, to end the Holocaust, to end fascism, to end evil. However, the war was never fought to liberate the Jews. Ending the Holocaust was a favorable byproduct. Joe Stalin, who was responsible for probably 90% of Nazi casualties, certainly wasn't motivated by saving the Jews. As a matter of fact, as the Soviet armies worked their way through Poland, when the Jewish community in Warsaw, Poland, rose up against the German army, Stalin intentionally waited for that conflict to wind down and for many of the Jews who were rebelling against Hitler to be slaughtered because he did not want them as future adversaries. The United States did not declare war on Germany. As a matter of fact, Germany declared war on the U.S., but they did not enter World War II to save the Jews. As a matter of fact, Jewish refugees were turned away from American shores prior to U.S. entry. And immediately after the war, a new conflict, the Cold War, quickly evolved between the Soviet Union and the United States. Think about the Civil War, another great crusade to end evil, the great evil of slavery. The North did not commence the Civil War to end slavery. The Emancipation Proclamation came later in the midst of the combat. And, as Engler points out in the article, the Emancipation Proclamation only freed slaves behind Confederate lines. It did not free slaves in the border states because Lincoln was concerned about them turning against the Union. And in the 100 years after the Civil War, the United States experienced the shame of Jim Crow laws, which sought to totally segregate American society. Since Jim Crow laws have been dismantled, and since the Civil Rights Acts in the 1960s, the United States is still plagued with racial animosity. So one could question the effectiveness of violent crusades to end evil. Robert J. Burroughs, in his outstanding article, The Political Objective and Strategic Goal of Nonviolence, he argues that nonviolent protest must contain two objectives. A political objective, which it's clear what the group is trying to accomplish, and a strategic objective, where it's quite clear who the nonviolent protesters are attempting to influence. I love this picture from 1967, in the midst of the anti-Vietnam War protests in the United States. A movement emerged called Flower Power, in which protesters would confront soldiers with flowers, oftentimes sticking them in the muzzle of their guns. And you can see these MPs sitting here going, oh, brother, what have we got ourselves into? But this image is wonderful because it talks about two tools that nonviolent protesters use. And as you read about Gandhi, as you watch Gandhi, he used these tools brilliantly. Number one, nonviolent protest involves some type of provocation. And number two, for nonviolent protest to work, it must be publicized. Provocative and public are two key elements of successful nonviolent protest. One mistake that contemporary students often make is they tend to look at nonviolent protest as a relatively new phenomenon. Mozi was a Chinese philosopher in 400 BCE during the Warring States period, and he advocated universal love and totally rejected violence in an incredibly chaotic time in China. While his ideas were certainly interesting and compelling, they did not end the violence that was ancient China. Buddhism, Hinduism, and Jainism all embrace this concept of ahimsa, which means non-injury, non-killing. However, the Indian subcontinent has been a battleground since antiquity. A key portion of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount is the phrase, "turn the other cheek." However, Christians often disagree about the meaning of this passage. To some Christians, it would mean pacifism, nonviolent protest. To other Christians, it would mean that you merely are not permitted to be the aggressor, but you have every right to self-defense, violent self-defense if necessary. And then moving to more contemporary examples, Henry David Thoreau was sickened by the Mexican-American War. He believed that it was a war of aggression that the United States instigated for selfish reasons. He refused to pay his taxes to support the war and promptly went to jail, but the war continued, and the desert Southwest is now part of the United States as a result. And then there is the wonderful example of India, the Indian subcontinent, which we will be studying this week. However, if you look at a contemporary map of India, you can see that immediately after independence, the area was partitioned between Muslims and Hindus. There were minorities in both countries who were horribly abused. You notice the striped area, which represents Kashmir. In Kashmir, the population is majority Muslim. However, they are still in India, which has led to decades of conflict between the two countries, which could someday erupt into nuclear war. An outstanding example of nonviolent protest that most Americans identify with is the example of Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. This is a wonderful picture of a white clergyman with black children at the Selma, Alabama protest in 1965. This protest was to secure voting rights for African Americans. It was a great example of provocation and publicity. And finally, there's the goddess of democracy. This goddess of democracy, this statue, was hastily created by free speech and free expression advocates in Communist China in 1989. This protest ended in violence. However, Chinese society ever since has become more expressive. So the results of nonviolent protest are complex. Sometimes it's incredibly effective, other times it's not. I want you to think about, as you navigate the readings and watch the Gandhi clips this week, keep asking yourself these questions. Does nonviolent protest work? What was Gandhi trying to do? Who was Gandhi trying to influence? How did he provoke? How were his provocations publicized? Keep thinking about these concepts as you watch and read this fascinating topic.